picture for a moment your family. Think about your children. Think about your grandchildren. Just go with me for a moment and think about what your kids might look like. I have some pictures here that I just think are adorable of children. And these could be any of our children or our grandchildren. In this case, I love this picture. I love the picture of the butterfly on this young lady's nose. It just makes me feel good. But the picture that really makes me feel the best is the picture of my two granddaughters. These are my granddaughters. The oldest one in the picture is Mally, the youngest one is Avery, and the lady in the center, that's my wife, Debbie. And it's kind of funny because my grandkids, not long ago, were spending some time with us, and they crawled up on the couch beside me, and they looked at me and they said, "Chucky." By the way, time out, Chucky is my grandpa name, just so you know. But they looked up and they said, "Chucky." They said, "What movie are we going to watch?" And so, of course, we turned on the television and we started looking through Netflix Kids. And what about this movie? Oh, we've seen that. What about that movie? We've seen that. What about this one? We've seen that. We went through doggone near every movie that seems to be on there, and they'd seen them all. And so I got this grand idea that what we should do is see a movie that they probably hadn't seen but would be entertaining, and that was Forrest Gump. Now, of course, the truth is Forrest Gump was produced long before these children were born. So they crawl up on the couch, we're sitting there, Forrest Gump starts, and something about Forrest Gump you need to think about, and that is it's a well-crafted movie. Now, if you look at me and kind of see the color of my hair, you'll know I was around during a lot of the things that are depicted in the movie Forrest Gump. So, if you're a baby boomer, you can see the movie and you look at it and you think, "Oh my gosh, I remember that. That's a funny rendition of that," and you have context. But for my two granddaughters, of course, there was no context. So I say the movie's well written because in reality, the parts that were in context I understood. They didn't really get the context, they just saw the humor in it. So let me carry you to a scene. We're in the early stages of the movie. And in the process of that, there's a place where little Forrest is sitting outside of the principal's office. I can remember a schoolhouse like this. He's sitting outside the principal's office on a little stool, and his mother's inside the principal's office. The door is open, and you can kind of see his mother in the distance with the principal sitting at the edge of the desk. And Mrs. Gump, played by Sally Field, Mrs. Gump was looking at the principal, and the principal was showing her Forrest school reports and indicating that, well, Forrest wasn't one of the sharpest kids in the school. And they wanted to send Forrest to a special school. And Mrs. Gump is sitting there looking up at the principal and says to him, she says, "Surely there is something that you can do to keep my Forrest in this school." And the principal sitting there on the edge of his desk, kind of looking down at Mrs. Gump, says, I remember the line clearly, "Is there a Mr. Gump, Mrs. Gump?" And the next scene, you have this picture of Sally Field, and she says, "He's on vacation." Now, after that scene, it cuts to the farmhouse where Forrest grew up. And here's Forrest outside at night, swinging on the big swing attached to the oak tree. And up in the top of the farmhouse, you see a light on, and you hear sounds coming from that room. The next image you see is Forrest. He's sitting on the step, on the porch of the farmhouse, just looking. And at this point in time, the principal comes out of the house, just wiping the sweat from him. And he starts to walk past Forrest, and he looks over and he says, "Your mama sure does want you to get a good education, boy." Forrest says, "Nothing." And then he looks back at Forrest and he says, "You don't say much, do you, boy?" And Forrest sitting there on the porch starts, which is making all of the sounds that he had just heard up in the upper room of the farmhouse. And of course, in the theater, everybody laughed. And my two granddaughters laughed. And it was one of those funny moments. But the truth of the matter is, that was probably one of the best depictions of sexual harassment that we could show or talk about in a class like this. It never occurred to me as many times as I watched Forrest Gump how crystallized and how clear that depiction was. Now, with what we're going to be doing today in this program, let's first define what is sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature which makes a person feel offended, humiliated, or intimidated. Now, if you think about what we saw was something that certainly could have been offensive, humiliating, and intimidating. So let me start off with a question for you, and that is, does your sexual harassment training properly define sexual harassment? Power becomes, for the most part, the dominant factor when it comes to the issues of sexual harassment. Over the past several years, I have interviewed 1,267 females. And I ask this question: do you feel like in the span of your lifetime and in your career that you have been the victim of sexual harassment? And 81% of the people that responded said yes, they had, in some form or fashion. And then I asked the question, okay, so let me make sure that I understand this. Do you feel that the harassment was based on the idea of power, or was it just pure sexual desire? And 67% of the 81% that responded said, no, it was really power-based. Now, just to be crystal clear, because I don't want to lose the audience here, someone said to me, well, have you not asked men? And that was a great question. So as a male, it occurred to me, well, wait a minute, I'm skewing the numbers. So let me start with men. And up to this point, I have interviewed 103 men asking the same question. Interestingly enough, 45% of the men that I've interviewed said they felt that they were, in some form or fashion, a victim of sexual harassment, and 100% of them said they felt that it was power motivated. So let's do this for just a second. Let's take a look at some folks. And let me ask you this question: what do these people have in common? So take a look at the first picture. Kevin Spacey. Now, I have to admit, I'm a House of Cards fan. When the program first came out, I started watching it, and it was like, oh my gosh, this is cool. Two things about it that I thought was amazing. One is that I could actually binge watch a TV program, which was kind of a novel idea. But the other was that somehow the writers in the House of Cards were writing this TV program and scripting it 2 years before they shot it. And once it was shot and showing on TV, it seemed to perfectly mirror what we were actually seeing politically, which I thought was kind of psychically crazy. But that's not the point of the picture. Here it is, Kevin Spacey, lifelong career as an actor, obviously the star of the House of Cards. And what is it, the fall of 2017, when the Me Too movement kicks in, someone says, but wait a minute, me too. And talked about his harassing behavior from many years ago. And of course, there was an immediate consequence. In fact, in most of the programs that I do, I say, every choice has a consequence. And so in Kevin Spacey's case, what happened? Well, immediately, House of Cards folded, at least for a temporary period of time. He was removed from that. But I think the more fascinating thing was, in the fall of 2017, actually in December of 2017, Kevin Spacey was a co-star in a movie that was set to come out. And his collapse occurred in late October, early November. And so the people in the movie said, oh my goodness, we cannot feature him in the movie. What did they do? They hired another actor, went in, shot the scenes that Kevin Spacey had been a part of, removed him from it, put the other actor into the picture, and the next thing you know, Kevin Spacey has disappeared. There are consequences to the choices we make. But what about this person? Now, again, I have to say, I loved the movie Tootsie. But Dustin Hoffman, again, accused of sexual harassment from years ago. And I thought to myself, oh my goodness, really? Well, side story. I happened to be out in California. I was doing some work out there, and I had an opportunity to talk with a lady. Fascinating conversation. Her first name was Charlotte, and she was involved as one of the producers for several of the soap operas that I remember my mother and parents and aunts and uncles, well, uncles not, but aunts watching. And so it was fascinating to carry on this conversation with Charlotte in the latter stages of her career, having had incredible success and broken the glass ceiling as a producer for what was predominantly a male-dominated industry. And I made some comment about, wasn't it amazing and sad about the comment that was made about Dustin Hoffman in the fall of 2017? And she says, oh, honey, it's all true. She said, that's the way he was. We just knew that's the way he was. And who was going to say anything during the time that he was incredibly active in his acting career? She said, you just didn't say anything for fear of risking your job. But just in case you think the only people I'm going to talk about are actors who have been exposed in some form or fashion, the next picture you see is a former politician, Andrea Ramsey. Now, Andrea Ramsey was an up-and-comer in the political world. There were a lot of people that looked at her and said, you know, as a female in the political world, she really has an incredible future. But because of her position in the political world, she also had a lot of power. And there was a younger man who was involved in her campaign and working with her politically. And apparently, and I don't know all of the details, and that's not what's significant here today, but Andrea used her power and her influence to sexually harass this younger man who worked in her organization. And at the time that harassment took place, he said, well, I can't say anything about this. But again, as people became comfortable or more comfortable with saying, wait a minute, it's not just them, it's me too. He spoke out. Today, Andrea Ramsey's career is functionally shot. She was running for office. She withdrew because she recognized that the political cost and the probability of a loss was greater than continuing the approach that she was taking. And just so you know, you probably can tell from the accent, I live in the southeast United States. In fact, I live in a community or outside of a community in Greenville, South Carolina. And this next picture is Will Lewis. That is our former sheriff. Now, I say former sheriff because Will Lewis ran an effective campaign. It was a hard-fought campaign. He and the person he was running against were battling back and forth, but eventually Will won the election. Well, that's great. But somewhere along the line, I mean shortly after the election, one of the ladies that worked in the sheriff's department, well, Will took kind of a liking to. Now, of course, now he is the sheriff of the area. So he takes kind of a liking to this young lady and he says, you know, I can help you advance your career. Well, now, let's be honest. Most of us, if someone says, the boss comes to us and says, you know, I can help you advance your career, you feel pretty good about that. So he said to her, he said, in fact, there's a sheriff's conference that's coming up. I think it would be wonderful if you attended that. That would be a good boost to your career. Now, she's feeling really good about the attention that she's receiving and the fact that it's supposed to go that way. Well, all things said, we'll also let her know that the sheriff's department had a limited budget, and so therefore they'd probably have to stay in the same hotel room. Well, he actually went a little further than that in some conversations that he had with her, and she was smart enough to record the conversations. In the world we live in today, every choice has a consequence, and we have to assume that anything we say is being recorded by someone somehow. So what ended up happening? She sued Will Lewis for sexual harassment. He said that was not the case. It became a very public confrontation with her playing the tapes of the recorded calls. Of course, Will was married, so this now became a very public and embarrassing situation. Now, in the state of South Carolina, you can't be removed as the sheriff unless you're voted out of office, other than the governor removing you, which in the case of Will Lewis is exactly what happened. So, let's think about this for just a second, because I showed you a series of pictures, and all of those pictures reflected blind spots. The one thing that you'll notice about all of those pictures is if you went to them individually and said, hey, Andrea, Will, Dustin, Kevin, are you going to do something that would derail your career for the rest of your life? Taint your image? Are you going to do something like that? They would look at you and say, of course not. That's stupid. I know better than that. You see, most of us know better, but when you're caught up in a blind spot, you don't recognize what you're doing and how what you're doing creates a consequence that you may not anticipate. And up to this point, one of the things that we have clearly addressed is the issue that the primary motivating behavior behind sexual harassment is power. So, let me ask you a question. As we think about sexual harassment in your training program, does your sexual harassment training properly address the motive of power? Now, I want to be honest with you. I've seen lots and lots of training programs, and most of them really stink. I mean, these are videos that were shot 10 or 15 years ago. It goes through one scenario. It asks the question, is this right? Everybody watching it knows what the answer is. They're sitting there bored to tears. It's almost like watching the TV program The Office talking about sexual harassment, except they changed it enough to make it a bit funny. But the question is, do we really address the deeper issues that we need to talk about? Now, I want to say this because I've had many people tell me this over the years, and that is, we used to know what the lines were. It used to be crystal clear. We kind of knew what we were supposed to do and how we were supposed to do it. We knew what was acceptable and what was not acceptable. That's those old videos that we see. And today, the truth is, the lines are confusing. It's not always crystal clear what is seemingly acceptable or not acceptable. So let me give you an example. I'm a member of the National Speakers Association, and I was at a winter conference, and I happened to have driven there. It was close enough to my home. And so here we are. We were with a number of people, with my NSA colleagues. And so several of us decided one evening we're going to go out for dinner. So in the process of that, I said, well, look, I've got my car. I'll be happy to drive. So there were two guys and a young lady and myself. And so the two gentlemen went to the back seat and sat down. And I walked over to the passenger side and I opened the door on the passenger side for the young lady who was coming to sit down. And in the process of doing that, she looked at me and she said, "What are you doing?" Well, I looked at her and I said, "Well, I'm opening your door. And then she looked back at me and she said, why? Now I'm thinking to myself, this must be a trick question. There's probably cameras somewhere. There's something taking place, because I thought that was the dumbest question I've ever heard. I was thinking, my mama from heaven would come down and whip me if I was not a gentleman and opened the door. And I said, well, I'm being a gentleman. And then she looked at me and she said, let me ask you a question. Okay. Would you have opened the door for John? No, I thought to myself, I know John. No, I said, of course not. She said, oh, so you're opening the door for me because I'm a female. She said, I thought we were supposed to be in a world where there's equality. She said, so if you're opening the door for me because I'm a female, but you're not willing to open the door for John, then apparently you're sexist. Now, I'm going to be the first to tell you, that caught me a little off guard. And then she stopped and she said, now look, I can tell that bothers you, but let me help you with something. Okay. She said, if you're treating me different as a female than you would treat the same male colleague, then that means you're treating me in a sexist way. She said, here's what would have been better. She said, what would have been better would have been for you to say, may I open your door? You see, because if you had asked me, may I open your door, I would have been empowered to say back to you, certainly, and allowed you to be the gentleman that you want to be. Or I could have said back to you, no, I got it, don't worry about it. Which would have, again, given me, that's the lady speaking, the power to make my own decision, not rely on someone to treat me differently than you would treat someone else. Now, I've been to a number of programs and a number of seminars where we have talked about this, and here's the question. Was I a gentleman or a sexist? Now, it's funny, because if we're sitting here in a live audience and I ask that question, here's the result that I'm getting today. The result I'm getting today is approximately 75% of the people say I am a gentleman. In fact, there are many ladies in the audience that are like, oh my goodness, I can't believe that. But I will also say to you, 25% of the audience says I'm sexist. And it's fascinating because there is a generational difference in the answer. People who are Gen X, older Gen X, or baby boomers, most of the ladies will say, well, my God, you could open my door anytime you want. And then many of the folks in the room will say, well, I open doors for men all the time. I mean, when we walk into a building or whatever, if someone's coming up, I'll hold the door for them. And I understand that concept. I get it. But she had a point. And that is, if I was willing to treat a lady coming into my car, sitting in the passenger side, different than I was going to treat a man, then it clearly meant I was seeing the roles of men and women different. And it caused me to recognize that we have to think about what are the generational differences that exist today in the workplace, because keep in mind, we've got 4 generations literally working in the workplace today. So, once again, does your sexual harassment training properly address generational differences? Again, I go back to most of the training I see is marginal at best. We don't talk about the hard things. We don't look at the difference between how a baby boomer versus a Gen X versus a millennial, etc., is going to see the world. It's kind of funny, I'll have to say this, but I have a 33-year-old son, and I've told him on more than one occasion, I said, son, you probably get a few more dates if you were a little more of a gentleman. Then I had the wake-up call, which is, oh, but wait a minute, perhaps the ladies that he would be considering taking out perceive it to be perfectly fine for them to get their own door because they see the world in a different state of equality than perhaps I was reared in as a baby boomer. Now, some people will say this whole thing is confusing. Well, confusing maybe, but some things have never been confusing. So let me share a couple of pictures with you. Look at this. This is not confusing. The only thing about this picture that is different that we probably need to address in the training programs is, notice, in this man's hand is his phone. Well, I would call it a phone. He might call it a mobile device. Obviously, it has a camera. So, in the world we live in today, that handheld mobile device with the camera becomes an interesting and unique way that sexual harassment can take place. Or what about this picture? Arm around the person who's sitting at the desk, the female who's sitting at the desk, perhaps looking down across her shoulder. Now, that's not acceptable behavior. In fact, thou shalt not touch. Now, okay, I'm going to go ahead and be totally transparent. Back in the mid to late 80s, I was tax partner in a CPA firm. And as you can imagine, with tax season ending April the 15th, we had all of the corporate returns by March the 15th, all of the individual returns by April the 15th. So on April the 15th, the last day of tax season, we were exhausted. We were just exhausted. And I remember one of the administrative assistants there had been with us for a number of years. Her name was Beth. Beth was absolutely one of the best people that I've ever had an opportunity to work with. I consider her a close friend. She was happily married. I was happily married. But I can promise you, on the last day of tax season, when that last individual came in and picked up that last extension to file so that we were done, we were just pooped. And I'll never forget, I would go up to Beth from time to time and I would just rub her shoulders. And it was kind of funny. Okay, now let me say this on the front end, so anybody watching this, was that the right thing to do? Absolutely not, especially in the world we live in today. But in those days, when I rub her shoulders, she would just lean into it and say, "Oh, don't stop. That feels so good." And quite frankly, I would have liked somebody to rub my shoulders because we were exhausted. Now, let me ask this question. Do you think in 1988, when that experience took place, do you think Beth felt like that I was participating in or sexually harassing her? What do you think? Okay, now as I look around, I'm guessing the majority of you are saying, no, she didn't feel that way. And I will tell you, she didn't. There was no intention, there was no feeling. It would not have passed the muster of sexual harassment then. However, it is not 1988. It's decades following. And because of that, we have to think about this. So if I walked over to Beth and today I started rubbing her shoulders and she leaned back and said, "Oh, that feels good." Is that the issue? No. Because in the world we live in, there's the possibility that someone across the room, perhaps someone a bit younger, that doesn't have the same relationship that Beth and I had, perhaps that person would look and say, look at him. He is violating our sexual harassment guidelines. He is touching her. He's not supposed to do that. I would never want him touching me. I'm going to report that. Now, we have to understand today that the world we may have lived in is not the world we live in today. And not only is it the issue between myself and someone else, but it may be the perception that another employee would have based on my actions. I have to be conscious of what I do. But this next picture actually happened. So take a look at the picture that you see, and notice this. And so let me share a little side story with you. I had been asked one time from a person in the National Speakers Association to perhaps provide some mentorship. They wanted to get into the speaking business, and they wanted some mentorship. And I said, that'll be absolutely fine. And so I said, here's what, I need you to do the following things, and we'll meet at Panera Bread and carry on a conversation so that I can start you in that process. And no problem. We sat down at Panera Bread, great. I helped her through a few things and gave her some continued work to do. And what I found most of the time was people would not continue the work. So, I was just trying to pay it forward for people that had helped me. But interestingly enough, she called me back and she said, hey, I've done that. I'm ready to take the next step. And I was like, yes, that's awesome. I was thrilled to hear that. So once again, we met at Panera Bread. And so here we were sitting across the table from each other, carrying on this conversation about the things that a person needed to do in order to be an effective speaker. And all of a sudden, I felt something rub up against my leg. And I was like, oh, that's weird. Someone's service animal must have gotten loose here and they're rubbing up against my leg. And because it's not the kind of experience that you'd have. And so I kind of leaned back a little bit and looked down, and there was her foot rubbing against my leg. And I looked at her and she was like, oh, I'm so sorry. I dropped my shoe and I was trying to find it. Now I'm sitting there thinking, if you dropped your shoe, your foot would not be halfway across the table rubbing up against my leg. Now, I don't know about you, but I would have called that sexual harassment. I have to admit, it was kind of funny because it was like, oh, that's weird. I mean, it just was not exactly the kind. I don't think I'd ever in my life had somebody take their shoe off and rub their foot up against my leg. But it was obvious to me that the concept of where this was going was not exactly the concept of where it should go. So let's think about that for a second, because sexual harassment is not always men to women. Sometimes it's women to men. So unwanted touching, or touching in general, invading someone's space in the world we live in today, is not something that's acceptable. But this next picture is something that I have had reported to me more times than I can count, and that is women to women sexual harassment. Now remember, sexual harassment is an issue predominantly of power, not just of sexual desire. It is of power. So I have had a number of people say to me, well, I understand this whole concept of what we're talking about here when it comes to sexual harassment, but you don't know my female boss. And sometimes that comes in odd ways. It comes in criticism of looks. It comes in criticism of dress. It comes in just overt power plays that at times makes people feel uncomfortable and falls into that category of sexual harassment. So let me ask this question, what about female to female harassment? Are you teaching the broad spectrum of how harassment could take place? And then you have emojis. Now, let's just be really honest with each other. It really didn't occur to me much, this whole concept of emojis. But apparently today, that's hot stuff. I mean, Apple has a whole brand new series with the new iPhones that are coming out of new emojicons that you can send out so that you can tell people, how do you feel without having to use words? I mean, I don't know, with my kids, I like to talk on the telephone. They like to text. It's a lot shorter. But it's even shorter if you just send the emojicon that says, here's how I feel. So I've put a couple on the screen. Now this is just 3 out of gazillions that are out there. But ask yourself the question, what does it mean? When you look at the emoji, what's the message that you're getting? There's one here that has the picture of 2 hearts in the eyes. So there's the emoji, 2 hearts in the eyes. Oh, how lovely. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean I love you? Does that mean I have amorous feelings to you? Or is it possible that you just completed a report and I looked at that report and said, oh my God, I love it. That's awesome. What a presentation. Hearts. What does that mean? The problem that we have today is that it is not necessarily who is conducting the action or who is sending it, but how is it being received. So, why are emojicons a potential source of harassment? You see, most of the sexual harassment documents that I've seen from organizations mention nothing about emojicons. Why? Because it's that early adoption, that new process, that different way of looking at things, that something that somebody grabs a hold of and doesn't think much about it and just uses it because it's kind of in the moment. But in the moment may be fine unless someone is perceiving that as something that potentially could be called sexual harassment. So, let me go once again to ask, does your sexual harassment training properly address hard issues? Are we talking about oddities which are now mainstay? Emojicons? Are we talking about female-to-female harassment? Are we talking about the hard issues that we need to discuss so that we can take something out of the subconscious and put it into the conscious so that we can think about our actions as those actions take place? The next picture you'll notice is a picture of Matt Lauer. Now, Matt Lauer, obviously, in 2017, early 2018, was the subject of news, just like a whole host of other people. People whose actions had likely gone on for a number of years, unchecked, no one saying anything, or if they did, it just going nowhere until we got to a tipping point. But let me say this because this is the important part of this. It wasn't what Matt Lauer did. Now, he made the news for about 3 days. Matt Lauer was released from NBC. People were, what did he do? And for about 3 days that was the news. But the real news was about NBC. The real news lasted for 2 or 3 weeks. And it wasn't, what did Matt Lauer do? The question was, what did NBC do? You see, there were 3 questions that dominated the news when the Matt Lauer story broke. And if there is anything that you're going to get from this training class, you need to know what these 3 questions are because they have incredible power when it comes to what's going to happen in your organization as you train and deal with issues of sexual harassment. So here's the first question. What did you know? Let me repeat that. What did you know? The second question. Well, when did you know it? Again, when did you know it? The third question, and this is the question of all questions, what did you do about it? Think about it. What did you do about it? What did you know? When did you know it? And more importantly, what did you do about it? In your organization, I'm going to say this at the risk of being a little too edgy, but every organization has their Matt Lauer. You have your somebody in the organization that probably is pushing the edge of the envelope, that if you ask people in the organization, if ever there were a story to break about sexual harassment, who would it be? And there's probably somebody in the organization that can tell you who that person is. That being said, if you're sitting there and the story breaks, and then someone comes up with the media and they've got the camera and it's rolling in your face, and they ask you the question, what did you know? When did you know it? And what did you do about it? What would you say? You see, the problem that in many cases we have is that leadership in the organization may not always support what the sexual harassment and harassment policies are in the organization. In other words, here I am in HR. My responsibility with HR and compliance is to make sure that we have effective policies put in place, that we notify people of and that they sign up for, etc. And that's wonderful, except for the fact that in most cases, above the level of the person who's responsible for HR, you have senior managers, including perhaps the CFO, the COO, the CEO, the president of the company, who might be the people that are or would be accused of harassment because for some reason leadership may not support current policies. So here's a question. When leadership does not support current policies, what position do you take? I'm not suggesting to you, by the way, that that's easy. That's a hard question. It's a hard question because most of the time we have our policies and we hope people follow them, but if it's above my pay grade and they're not, if I take a hard position, then the reality is I might lose my job. So for fear, people in power get a pass. There's another picture that I want to show you. I would promise you that I would butcher pronouncing his last name, but this is the former president of the University of Southern California. Now, I want you to think with me for just a second because this gentleman was in academia, worked hard to advance himself and his career, and in the latter stages of his professional life, had achieved the level of president of the University of Southern California. And if you ask people, what did he do? People would say, oh my gosh, he was the pinnacle and picture of perfection when it came to how he interacted with people. No one would ever accuse this man of sexual harassment. But today he is no longer the president of the University of Southern California. Why? Well, let's think about it for just a second. Apparently there was a physician who was an employee of the University of Southern California. And the physician's responsibility was providing medical care for the numerous students that came in and through the University of Southern California. And apparently the physician was, let's put it this way, accused of inappropriate behavior when it came to female exams. So many students had complained about the physician, and nothing seemed to happen. But again, there's always a point when choices have consequences. And so somewhere along the line, it kind of got to the tipping point. There were just so many accusations that eventually the questions were asked. Well, Mr. President, what did you know? Well, I knew there were complaints. Well, Mr. President, when did you know it? And as he opens his file drawer, well, I've known it for a number of years because here's the file on this doctor with the complaints in it. And then the last question, which is the critical question. Well, Mr. President, what did you do about it? And that's the question he stumbled on? The answer was, not enough, if anything. So the evidence was clear. No action was taken. So here is the former president of the University of Southern California, who is no longer the former president, or no longer the president of the University of Southern California. Why? Because not that he had committed sexual harassment, but he failed to take action. And failing to take action is just as wrong as perhaps committing what was committed. He is no longer the president of the University of Southern California. So here's a question. Does your sexual harassment training properly address failing to take action? Again, I have looked at so many sexual harassment policies, and they're so vanilla. And rarely do they really go after the hard questions and put in stone, here is what we do and here is how we do it, and there are teeth. In fact, let me ask you a series of questions. Number one, does your organization have a written policy? Now, if I'm sitting here looking at a live group, I'm going to say the majority of you say, yes, we have a written policy. Great. How is that policy communicated to employees? Now, I'm a vice president in a public company, and every month we get an email that is sent out to all employees that talks about issues of sexual harassment and other ethical issues that we're obligated to know and to follow as employees of the company. And I'm going to say this in all candor. If you've been there maybe 3 months, you see that there's probably 15 questions, 10 are asked on the email that comes out, and it's kind of a circle of the questions. And so after about 3 months, it would take you maybe 15 seconds to go through yes, no, yes, all of the above, etc., etc. And then at the end, you click submit. And if you've gotten them all right, it says, thank you, Charles Gallagher. And I've completed it. And if you miss one, it goes red, you've missed one, and it shows you what you missed, and then you have to correct it. Now, I understand how it's communicated, but I would also tell you it's probably fairly ineffective. We're checking a box saying we've done it, but what have we done? Let me ask you another question. If you polled employees, would they say that the policy is enforced? Now, that's a harder question. Is the policy enforced? And the last question, has there been any enforcement of the sexual harassment policy? Is there anything as an HR professional that you can do where you can say, look, here's the policy, here's what happened, here's how it was enforced, and we have multiple examples of that. So in the future, should there be an issue, we know that we can tell someone with the camera that yes, we have a policy and yes, it's enforced. Unfortunately, most organizations where I have been asked to come in and to help with their sexual harassment program, when I have polled employees as an independent party, have found that most say the policy isn't enforced and there are no real examples of any evidence that would say that the policy is going to be enforced. So, what should I do? Now, as we've gone through this process today, this might be a program different than what you anticipated, but I'm going to suggest to you, you have to look at the world through a different set of lenses. The times they are a-changing. Bob Dylan wrote that in a song. I don't know that he had any idea that that was going to be as prophetic as it is. But we've got to look through different set of lenses. You see, I've got to look through a set of lenses that says, as a baby boomer, I have a bias toward being a gentleman, which, by the way, may to other people in the workforce paint me as a sexist without having any intent that that's the case. So am I willing to look through a different set of lenses? Am I willing to look through the lenses of what does it mean to have different ways to communicate, like emojicons? Are we talking about those things? And am I willing as an HR professional to take a hard stand when I know someone in a senior role is not following the company policy or the rules? Are they invalidating them by creating a culture above the rules that says they don't apply to people of power? You see, it starts with you. It starts with you. A couple of solutions I might want to ask, or add rather, would be don't be part of the bystander effect. Now, some of you are like, bystander effect? What is that? Okay, so let me play out this for just a second. To me, it's kind of strikingly funny, and by the way, this is very generational. But if I stepped outside of the building that I'm in, and outside the building there was an accident, and someone perhaps was injured in this automobile accident, what would be the first thing I do? Well, I would take my phone out. You see, I call it a phone still. Most people today are calling it a mobile device. But I would call it my phone and I would dial 911, because to me, that's what one would do. But I would tell you, and I don't mean to be disrespectful at all to my children. I love my children. But my kids would instantly take that phone and there's some flick of a wrist or something that they can do, and all of a sudden video comes on and they would be sitting here videoing everything. And you see that every day on the news. You see bystanders who, instead of taking action to do something to help, are trying to video what's taking place so they can upload it to Instagram or upload it to Facebook, or go Facebook Live or YouTube or whatever else may come down the pike that would maybe date what I'm saying right now. So the question is, don't be part of the bystander effect. If you see something, say something. When the young lady said to me as I was opening her door, when she said to me what she said, she changed my perspective. She wasn't trying to be rude. She wasn't trying to be unkind to me. She was trying to help me learn. If you see something, say something. And the other thing that I would say is, for any of us, the most logical thing that we could do in our organization is to recognize what sexual harassment is, interrupt it, and confront it. Because as long as I'm going on autopilot, when I mean autopilot, I mean it's just subconscious. I am breathing, I am talking, my heart is working, my brain is active. That's autopilot. But that's all subconscious. What happens if I go from subconscious to conscious? Now all of a sudden I'm aware. So when you recognize, interrupt, and confront someone who is potentially violating the policy, it isn't about bringing some form of justice. What it's about at that point is helping them go from the subconscious to the conscious brain. Because ultimately, it's up to us to stop the behavior. So let me ask one other question, or make this statement rather. It's up to us to create effective training. If you looked at your training program with a clear set of lenses, would your program be addressing some of the hard issues that we've talked about today? And if the answer to that question is no, then I have to ask you a question. Would you like a lawsuit with that? Because if you're failing to provide what you need to provide in order to provide a wonderful, safe employment relationship or environment, then invariably, if someone does something wrong, you'll get a lawsuit. Now, I started off today talking about my two granddaughters. I'm going to put their pictures back up again, Mally and Avery, and my lovely wife, Debbie. And I started today talking about the movie that we watched, and it hit me as we were sitting there watching the movie. I've just witnessed, in a movie form, sexual harassment. So here's the thing. Some people have said to me, well, wait a minute, Chuck, you're a male baby boomer. Why are you talking about sexual harassment? Why is it important to you? And the answer to that question is very simple. Perhaps, if today we are willing to talk about issues like this, if perhaps we're able to go from subconscious to conscious, if perhaps we can raise the awareness and the discussion that's taking place, perhaps when my two granddaughters are going to college, they will not be holding that little sign that says, "Me too." You see, as I see it, all of us have the opportunity to be the difference.